So you spoke about uh, the electricity part, the electricity generation in terms of fossil fuels, and then the use of electric vehicles. Uh, could you talk a bit about agriculture, because the use of water, the issues of stubble burning that we have in India, uh, are you seeing solutions, or are you seeing innovative approaches in that area? And how big is that problem, and is there a solution? At a recent pensions conference that I attended, a global pension conference, one of the suggestion was investors are looking to invest in mangroves. So mangroves, growing and cultivating mangroves is going to become an asset class in itself. So investors are for pensions are used to investing in farmland and timberland and those kind of, but as a offset for carbon and climate, investing in mangroves. Are you hearing anything of that sort? Is it happening in the foundation, in the CSR space that you interact with?
Okay, fair point. I didn't touch on agriculture, I must admit, but certainly, with half of India being agrarian and the contribution to GDP still about 14%, but that's also the rough breakup in most countries of the world. Definitely, the impacts and the level of threat on agriculture is not less. There is high climate sensitivity that agriculture has. And
Yeah.
also, I think that's mostly recognized that as a sector, it will suffer quite considerably in various kinds of emission scenarios. I think there is no dispute on how there is definitely need to be research and focus on how climate events are impacting and what exactly the impact is being felt on. Sometimes it's on crops which have specific geographic indications. For instance, apples from Himachal and basmati rice from foothills of Himalayas and several other things. And there are, I think, now greater evidence that like most of the crops are impacted from climate. The question that you asked on whether or not there is uptake of this in the CSR space, I am not fully aware about, and I will not be in a position to comment, but certainly it feels to me that there is more and more recognition of how the impacts on the agriculture sector are getting immense, and more industry which seek raw material from agriculture, whether they are food production or food processing or sugarcane or a textile, etc., are also recognizing that the impacts of climate are immense. So whether what is the level of action that they are taking is something now to be discussed. But certainly it's not just an awareness that they have. They're quite, I think, up to speed that climate is impacting their profits, expenditure, and as well as supply chain. So
Right.
in Maharashtra, we did a small survey which we administered to about 400 medium, small, and large companies in the state. And we found out that most of the companies above average, like 70-75%, were very well aware of impacts. And but I think below average were aware of what action they need to take.
They could take. Yeah.
So definitely, that gap exists very much, but also, as you see in the national the political situation that we have, the agriculture reforms are long overdue. The question is that how can you best insert them into a system so that they can go through and they don't get left behind, even as other sectors move further along the road.
Jeff, if you have questions lined up, we can open up for questions.
So I have a question. You were talking about battery storage. One of the things with battery storage is the idea is also to enable more decentralized mechanisms for using renewable energy sources. What are some of the barriers potentially to doing that, and how can those barriers be overcome in different parts? I know it's going to be different in different parts of India, but if you could speak to some of those, it might be helpful for some of the teams who I know are also thinking about how do you combine that with electric vehicle use.
Sure, and you're right. I mean, battery applies both for transport as well as for the power sector. But with regards to the power sector, there are India has so just in terms of government's commitment, India has set itself up for 175 gigawatts of renewables by 2022, out of which 100 gigawatts were supposed to be solar. And of the 100 gigawatts, 60 was roughly large utility scale, and 40 gigawatts was decentralized renewable, which meant that there had to be 40,000 megawatts of deployment of decentralized systems across India, which is enormous. Now, the way the things have progressed so far is, as you can imagine, a lot of bids won, tenders put out, and contracts given, and deals made for utility scale solar. So you have the biggest solar plant coming up in Pavagadh in Telangana. You have the state of Rajasthan, which has very good wind speed, having a lot of large utility solar. But at the same time, there is a lot of need to build the capacity on decentralized. It's not that decentralized is not happening, but it needs to be increased a little bit. What is happening is that there are several technical and financial models of what kind of decentralized systems work, and there is a lot of room to to combine renewables with battery storage and make it good. Right now, even the kind of batteries that are being thought of are very different. But 4 years back, you were looking at just more rudimentary batteries, so to speak, and the energy storage market was still not very evolved. But as it's becoming bigger, and as especially the solar installations are increasing, uh, and definitely in an Indian context where the the urban to rural landscape is also through many layers of the like many across a spectrum. So you just don't have a city and a village. You have a peri-urban area, you have a reserve forest area, and outside of that you have the buffer zone. You have some of the fragile ecosystems where it's not possible for poles and wires to reach, and those are the areas where it's best to install a decentralized system. There are many rural areas where it's not possible to give 24 hours electricity, and it's best given through a solar and storage combined system. There are examples, interestingly, in the state of Chhattisgarh, where the health centers across the state decided to install solar combined with battery. Now, there is evidence that people have done over there some survey where they have found out that the health centers which had the solar system installed had 50% more walk-ins, had more childbirth deliveries happening, and had more surgeries being done as compared to the others. Sorry, I have a power cut in where I am. uh, uh, and there is just a better ability to vaccinate people, because they could buy a fridge and they could keep a fridge because they had the storage. So there are all of these opportunities, and the examples are endless. There are several examples in the state of Karnataka where organizations have worked to find out what kind of a system works for the smallest of the household and in the cheapest way, and what is the technical model and what is the financial model. It turns out that in most cases, a poor household was spending a lot of money on diesel to run the generator back up, because that was the only source of their power for a couple of hours in the evening. And if they were to switch to solar plus a battery system, it's much better. I'll give one more example. In Sundarbans, which is Sundarbans is an interesting landscape. It's a landscape where you have the Royal Bengal tiger. It's also an estuary where the land meets the fresh water meets the seawater, and it's between India and Bangladesh. And it's a extremely fragile ecosystem. Of course, you can't have the grid connection over there. And there are several villages in Sundarbans which are literally floating among the estuary, where you have all these small solar and battery storage systems, where there is clear evidence that a small shopkeeper is able to open his shop now after 6 p.m. More people come at his shop because they come and charge their mobile phones over there. And, he just gets increased sales. There are examples of how women who go and collect honey in the day in Sundarbans can come back in the evening and can do some small stitching and make a little buck on the side. There are examples of how children can study after evening because they have the lights on in the house for 4 hours. So I think it's a story of empowerment. It's also a story of how it's possible to change lives without making too much expenditure, and it's always not the biggest policy of the government which will bring change, and a lot is possible from the bottom up. And really the decentralized by the nature of it is just bottom up and beautiful. Well, I'm not an investor, but I think you do consider your what's your rate of return, and I think the method to calculate in this is also the amount of scalability it will receive in terms of the felt need in the society, and things like battery, I think are just necessary regardless. So if they are, and I don't think that the question really is whether or not they are good investment decisions, and those I think are really like project level decisions on what's the cost of capital, what is the kind of risk that you're looking at. But really the one risk that does not lie in this case is the risk of the external policy or the landscape, because in my mind a lot of global momentum on climate is only going to increase. The imperatives for action are only going to increase, and if you look at it in a very broad way, then there are lots of research and studies already available, not by climate scientists but by economists of the world, who explain that acting on decisions which are climate friendly is costing X today will cost 3X or 2X tomorrow. So basically, the rationale is that the cost of inaction on decarbonization will far outweigh the cost of action. And I think that's quite fundamental, but that's not really like a, it's a broad brushstroke answer. It's not an answer to the specific question where if it was which projects to take or which to not take. But I think the the wider decision is quite clear that just the cost of inaction of on climate is going to be far more in future, and therefore it's best to do something today.
Uh, I'll add on to that from the internal rate of return aspect. While it might be higher, something you can consider, you don't have to do this in any way whatsoever, but something to consider is if you take the portfolio mentality of guiding your investments, but maybe not just picking one winner, but allowing the opportunity for investments in multiple solutions. And so maybe that internal rate of return changes, and by allowing that flexibility, maybe there's more opportunity in the future. But I don't know if that helps or is just or does not, but that's my first thought when you said that.
Right. I mean, first of all, I think even under the micro, small, medium enterprises, there is lots of investment that's happening in India. A lot of the economy is about the medium, small, micro enterprise. When the COVID recovery happened, the government stimulus package was essentially to make sure, in a way, that that sector is well kept. And my general feeling is that the fact that a lot of manufacturing, a lot of production, processing, and activities happening at the level of small industries, they're a good audience to be able to do something for, because also the cumulative energy consumption that happens in the MSME sector is going to be enormous, because of the absolute number of the MSMEs and the scale of their operation. And sometimes it's easier to make things for a smaller entity, rather than convincing large organizations and big corporations to make change. And on the specific point of whether things or the technology should be more or equally savvy for the private consumers, I think the choice then to be made is at what level are we putting the technology out? Is it something which is going to help the industry sector and make a big change? Because it will be like there is a value chain that is associated with it as well, and the industry in India pays more for the power they purchase than the resident the residential segment does, and there is a cross subsidy there. In some other countries in Europe, the residential sector pays more and the industrial sector pays less, which will never be the case in our country. So when you create something for the industry sector, which allows them to be off grid or empowers them to not buy power from the distribution company, ultimately it's impacting the revenue of the distribution company and they don't like it. And that's one of the reason why things like solar rooftop, etc., are not taking off in the small industry sector, mostly unless they don't get mandated. The commercial and industrial sector are like the cash cows for the distribution company. So I think all I'm saying is when you make a decision on what to do, that value chain of how, the money trickle will happen has to be kept in mind for that technology to also have pickup. But certainly the industrial sector and the commercial sector are fairly worthwhile, in my opinion, to have a dent. On the residential sector, the thing is, and I come from a background which is also one of a campaigner, and I really feel that sometimes 20 people in a city can make a difference. If 20 Delhiites did something positive, and those Delhiites are well-known people, a lot of people will watch and get behind them. So, if you're also looking at having a solar panel at home, unless it's not something that is really economical and cost effective, the masses will not be able to put it up. So what is that technology which will allow in a small roof in an apartment to be able to give solar generated energy to 10 households from that little patch of roof, and at the same time be sufficient? If there are things like that for household level, I think that's going to be interesting, because one of the troubles, for example, with solar in Delhi, some people say, is that Delhi doesn't have enough roof space. So you have building complexes and you have a little patch of roof, and that's not enough to generate enough power for the entire building. So where do you even put up those panels in the first place, and you don't have land? So when land is at a premium, then just better technology so that you have better efficiency of the panel is the one thing to think about. Because the distributor is where I as an industry get my power from, and I pay the distributor say 5 rupees per unit of power. And when I start to have a solar panel, then I buy X amount of power less from the distributor, and they just get, so there is less purchase of power from the distributor itself, and that is how they will get less revenue. And that's what I meant, but it's a long circuit. I was just explaining it to say that that's the fundamental reason of resistance, why rooftop sometimes doesn't take off, because the power distribution companies don't feel confident that if their customers will go, where will they get their revenue from? Yes, and which is why I think because they cannot take that decision, or they can't make it mandatory, the like there is solar panels that are getting installed, but it's just that to smoothen it out, meaning that you really remove that bottleneck. That removal of bottleneck will only happen if there is some kind of a policy which then makes it mandatory, or just obliges the discoms to make sure that this is the preferred option. Right now, unless you don't make it the preferred option, it will not happen, and many people will just stick to procuring power like they are doing in any case. But to answer your question, there are several policies which are in place. It's called the renewable purchase obligation. So if you are a distribution company, you have an obligation to buy 2% or 5% of your power from renewable sources. So that is very small, but at least the government has made some mandatory requirements so that the distribution companies get used to the idea of solar and wind coming into the mix, and sooner or later they will be coming more and more. So right now the renewable purchase obligations are 5% or 10%. As time passes, you can make those obligations stronger and bigger, so that then there is no way for the distribution companies to shy away or to not be committed to it. It's also legacy issues, because these are very complicated matters in a way, on how power is produced and how power is wheeled and then it is transmitted and all of that. And uh, basically you are how do I say, you are really you are moving the fundamentals or the backbone of the economy in that sense, because traditionally, and even today, 70% of India's power does come from thermal power plants. So if you're trying to dislodge a system which worked till now, because now the system doesn't work and climate is an imperative, then it's not a good enough reason in the Indian context, unless you don't explain the economic rationale of it. Any thermal power plant producer would not like to shut the power plant simply because it's polluting or it's causing damage to health. If it's able to dispatch cheap power, it will continue to do it. And I think that's where the dichotomy is, that on one hand you're looking at global issues, global narratives like climate, and putting them in the Indian context, and on the other hand you're looking at just a very myopic view of what makes sense in terms of a investment and return point of view. What is the power purchase agreement, and how that compares in terms of the scale of action that is needed to bring the change.
I would make a point for the students when in India, of course, the large utility space works, but eventually what generally succeeds and is scalable is decentralized solutions in any aspect, be it in power or be it in a lot of other different industries. And if you listen to Mirai Chatterjee's interview, she talks about women and informal enterprise and what kind of scalability options you can have across women in small enterprises, and that's also an aspect of not a direct but indirect aspect of climate change, because small women-led entrepreneurial activities are very, very resource efficient. So they are very conscious of the resources that they use because they don't have too many to use. So those solutions for scaling up those kind of activities, those kind of enterprises also tend to have a lot of merit. And Aarti, just on your point, or you spoke about a thermal power project, like what happens to these thermal power projects. And I was listening to NTPC chairman. So they have a big thermal power plant, very old, just outside Delhi, the city of Delhi, and they've shut it down. And apparently they have converted the entire thing into a park, and it is bigger than Central Park of New York. So it's bigger, it has more trees, it has more. So, there's another way of just figuring out something is not working, but something else can be done around it. And I found it fascinating, bigger than Central Park, right? And just outside Delhi, but that's a beautiful thing, which when it really gets developed.
Agree.